everyone, I am Alexa Dunn, and today I am going to be going over 7 mistakes that newbie writers make. If you're newer to writing, and specifically novel writing, you might be making some of these very mistakes or might remember when you made them as a newbie writer, and I hope that by identifying some of these big issues that you might be able to start digging in and avoiding them when you draft or fixing them in revision. The good news is all of these are fixable. So the first one is info dumping, and this is when you cram tons of backstory and extra information into your book, but especially in the beginning. Like if you start out your first page and your character muses for like 30 paragraphs about who they are and where they come from and how they're feeling, that is info dumping. You see this a lot with world building too. Your reader doesn't have to know the mechanics of everything about your world and how it works right up front. You want to sprinkle those details into your book over many pages and scenes and chapters through active and interesting scenes and character interaction. The second thing is going to sound really similar and it's kind of involved, and that is describing everything. And by this, I mean giving a play-by-play of everything that your character does or that happens to them, that the reader just doesn't necessarily need to read or experience to enjoy your story. This might be that your character wakes up and they pick out an outfit and they get dressed and they take a shower first and then they get dressed and then they have breakfast with their family and you introduce the family and then they go to the bus stop and then they get on the school bus and they go to school and they go to their locker and they talk to their friends, etc., etc., etc. You don't need to give us a play-by-play of every single thing that your character does or thinks or feels. This is going to slow down your pacing and drag your plot, and honestly, it's just kind of boring. The play-by-play typically doesn't have enough conflict, and you need conflict to drive good story, which is actually the next mistake that a lot of newbie writers make, and that is there's just not enough conflict in the story. Conflict is the things that get in the way of what your character wants, the things that make their life or their journey or their goals difficult. From conflict, we derive stakes, which are the things that your character stands to lose if the conflict gets in their way. And this is what drives good storytelling, good conflict. And conflict isn't always, like, we're gonna die. Good conflict can be a disagreement with a friend. Good conflict could be, that you like a boy, but he doesn't notice you. All of these things are conflict, some more interesting than others. But if your plot is feeling inert or you're just not getting the response from people that you want, think about your conflict. Is enough of it happening to your character, around your character, in your story? Running right off of that is big newbie mistake I see is that nothing bad happens to the main character, and or the main character is perfect and has no flaws. These things go hand in hand and they tie back into conflict. If your character is flawless and is just good at everything and has no flaws whatsoever, you're going to lack conflict with other characters, an internal conflict, though I guess being nauseatingly perfect can definitely create conflict. But so often in books, writers are afraid to messy up their characters, to make them a little dirty, to give them character flaws, occasionally make them difficult to like or annoying, and also just have bad things happen to them. And I will tell you, even when you're a little bit more experienced in a first draft, it can be really hard to do bad things to your characters, to throw obstacles in their way that make their life and the pursuit of the story difficult, because we like our characters and we don't want to do bad things to them. Though eventually you are going to turn a corner and you're just going to start being like, should I kill them? Should I kill the people that they care about? Murder! Murder's fun. Killing people in books is fun, but it's really common not to want to have anything bad happen to your character. And so I recommend just taking the plunge. Like, what is the worst thing that could happen to your character? Do that thing. Do that thing. It's going to make your book So much more interesting, more dynamic, and all of this creates conflict. Another big thing that I have seen novice writers do is have really messy dialogue tags. This means that either every single line of dialogue has a tag where you say, she said, Tyler spoke, etc., etc. You don't have to identify the speaker with every single line of dialogue, but you should do it pretty frequently so that people have a sense of who is talking, who said what, and where people are in the scene. But your go-to should be said. Said is the invisible dialogue tag. Readers' eyes just kind of gloss over it very neatly. It's not distracting. Whereas I see a lot of newer writers writing, he ejaculated. No, don't use that one. Or he exclaimed. Ellie sighed. He whispered. I'm guilty of using all of these, by the way, but I try to use them incredibly sparingly. The problem is when every single dialogue tag is creative and specific. You really can use said 95% of the time. Related to that, this is a punctuation thing that's also about dialogue tags. Your punctuation should be inside the quotation mark. And if you're saying she said, the she is lowercase. So you're going to say, hey, Ellie, comma, quotation mark, lowercase s, she said, period. That one drives me a little crazy in kind of that like anal retentive, like grammar nerd way. And I also used to mess it up all the time, guys, by the way. In my early fanfic, my dialogue tags were an absolute freaking mess. And I had a beta reader who like whipped me into shape, and I was really against it at first. I was so sure that she was wrong, and then she was right. And I learned how to properly format my dialogue tags, and things have been better ever since. Another mistake I've been seeing lately, this is kind of a new-ish newbie mistake, but I've seen a lot of it, and that is having too many points of view. I've seen rampant dual POV, 3 POV, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. POV, and I think it's because we've seen a couple of books in the market, specifically YA, that have multiple POVs that have done really well. But so often, stories just don't need extra POVs. The extra POVs detract from the main story and actually drain it of tension. Part of this is also that multi and dual POV are just difficult to execute well. Especially in dual POV. Let's say it's the male and the female main character, so the main character and the love interest. So often, especially if you're writing in first person, which is a really common tense for YA, you just can't tell the characters apart. Or the biggest sin is inevitably one character is going to be way more interesting than the other, and readers are going to naturally gravitate towards one character. And essentially your extra POV or POVs are going to detract from that and possibly frustrate your reader. So I'd say in 90% of cases, my advice to people is to tell it in a single POV from the point of view of the most compelling character. And it's usually the character who has the biggest journey and growth and or who has the most to lose. And 90% of the time, if you're doing those girl-boy POVs, it's going to be the girl. That's just a YA convention. And then with multi-POV, if you're doing, 4, 5, 6 POVs, you run into similar problems. Making each of the characters stand out enough that you can tell them apart. When someone starts reading a chapter, they should know immediately whose POV they're reading from, regardless of whether there are chapter headers that tell them. But also, when you have a larger cast, again, you're going to have your readers gravitating towards one, maybe 2 characters more than others, and you don't want to kind of create this unbalanced feeling of people, rushing through pages and kind of being or being annoyed because they don't care about this character and they want to get back to the characters that they do care about. It just takes a lot of skill and practice to execute dual and multi-POV well, and so typically I advise that you walk before you run and focus on single POV narratives. And last but certainly not least, one of the big newbie mistakes that I see, because I did it a lot when I was a newer writer, I still default to it now, but I work really, really hard to fix it, and that is white room syndrome. This kind of dovetails into show, don't tell, which I purposely didn't go over because I feel like you've heard that 8 million times. Show, don't tell. Many newbie writers tell instead of show. But I am trained in journalism, and I think there is nothing wrong with a bit of telling, though showing is very helpful and a very good style to employ. But white room syndrome is when your characters are in a scene, they're interacting, they're talking, they're walking, etc. And they might as well be in a white room because you give no description or context or details that give the reader something to hang onto and paint a mental picture of. White room syndrome leaves stories feeling just very generic and blank. If they can't picture scenes or characters or actions, they're going to get bored. So I'm actually going to do a whole video on white room syndrome because this is a problem that I have struggled with and that I have come up with all sorts of techniques and shortcuts to fix in my own writing. But the gist of it is, write the way you write, but in revision, you're going to want to go back and think about the visuals that you are offering the reader. Don't go overboard and describe everything because showing has pitfalls. Sometimes telling is the right way to write a scene or a chapter or a perspective. So it's all about balance. But to fix white room syndrome, just think about the descriptions that you're offering your readers as they're reading. So those were my 7 mistakes that I see newbie writers making. There are more mistakes that newbie writers make, but I didn't want to, kind of go off the deep end. Because typically, you're not going to make all of these mistakes. You're going to make a few of them depending on who you are as a writer. And as I said, the good news is that they are all fixable. I find that the key is to identify the mistakes that you're making and why you may be losing readers' attentions or your writing might not be where you want it to be. I hope it was helpful, and let me know in the comments any questions you have about any of the things that I have talked about. This was a very broad overview, and I'm definitely interested in talking more about a lot of these things. As I already mentioned, I'm doing a video on white room syndrome. I've already got a video on info dumping that may have even already posted to this channel. It may post later, but there's a video on it. And I'm keen to talk about a lot of these things. I have tons of feelings about multi and dual POV, obviously. So hit me up with your questions in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, thumbs up it. I'd love to hear from you. But as always, happy writing, everyone.